Welcome to the Property Voice Podcast, helping you to navigate safely through the world of property investing. Get the lowdown and updates, insights and outcomes on all matters property with a splash of entertainment along the way. The Property Voice, a voice to trust among the crowd. Now, let's get started with your host, Richard Brown.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Property Voice podcast. My name is Richard Brown, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you join me again on the show today. Now, as we alluded to last time, property cycles are a little bit like clockwork, according to some at least. And here today we invite Akhil Patel from Ascendant Strategy, our subject matter expert, to share with us his own research and indeed that of others before him that makes a very compelling argument for a clear and definite pattern in the property market. Now, not only this, but we sow the seeds of what the heck to do about it once we know about all this. So let's just have a listen to Akil as he joins me in Property Chatter then.
Okay, so let's get on with this week's featured topic with Property Chatter.
Well, I'm very pleased to have a very special guest, a subject matter expert, with me on the call today, and that's Akhil Patel from Ascendant Strategy. And this series is all about life cycles in general, and I know that Akhil has a particular interest in the property cycle generally. But Akhil, hi, how are you? How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks, Richard. Good to be on this call.
Thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate that. Akhil, perhaps you could kick us off by just giving us a little bit of a context, a background as to who you are and what you're interested in property cycles is in particular. That'd be really useful to set the scene, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I'm the director and founder of Ascendant Strategy, which is a advisory company which does research on economic and commodity and stock market cycles, and it provides the benefit of that expertise to investors, be they corporate or individual investors, to make better long-term investment decisions. And the most important cycle that we focus on is what some people refer to as the 18-year property cycle. And we very much specialize in helping investors use knowledge of the cycle to make better investment decisions with respect to property.
Fantastic. So it sounds like I've got the right man in the chair to answer some of these questions. So that's a good start, isn't it? Yeah, good start. So let's get straight into it. I've downloaded your research paper on the 18-year property cycle. Forgive me if that's not the right title. Read that with great interest. But it talks a lot about property cycles, business cycles. Of course, you've got the stock market cycle, and I guess you could even add in a little bit of there, the financial cycle in general. And I guess, my question is, where do they all begin and which one starts them off?
It's a good question. In my view, it all comes down to the property cycle. And the reason is that land, which is really the driver of the property cycle, and speculation in land is in some ways quite fundamental to our economies, and it's certainly very important to our banking system. And when you get very high periods of speculation in land and real estate, it sort of generates quite a lot of economic activity and then sort of draws in the banking system. And when that collapses, as we saw happen in the UK and the US in 2007, 2008, it leads to a general collapse in the economy because banks stop lending to businesses start to fold, unemployment increases, and the government has to intervene in the economy in a major way. And so fundamentally, in our view, it starts with property cycle.
So it starts with the property cycle. And of course, you talk about the 18-year cycle, don't you? And I kind of just want to get a bit of a handle as to how predictable the 18-year element of it is, based on your research.
Yeah. Well, an 18-year reference to 18-year is kind of shorthand But actually, if you look at the historical data in the US and the UK, and this has been done by authors like Fred Harrison for the UK and my business partner Phil Anderson for the US, if you go back to look at the historical record back to the early 19th century, actually the regularity of it, 18-year cycle is incredible. It really is on average and almost very precisely 18 years from boom to bust and bust to boom. And while I'd never say that you could set your kind of watch by it, the regularity in the historical record is actually quite amazing.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I saw that, so thanks for sharing. I think two kind of follow-on questions really is, it's really what tends to happen, and I know you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what tends to happen typically in a cycle? What are the activities, if you like, and the triggers? But equally, if it's so predictable, why is so little understood about it, in particular with regard to real estate property?
Well, to take the first question, I mean, you generally find within an 18-year cyclical period kind of almost four phases. When the cycle starts, you tend to get economies returning to growth and the property market starts growing again and people are interested in investing and builders start building again. And you kind of have a period of about 7 years of expansion. You then tend to find after about 7 years that you get a sort of a mid-cycle blip or slowdown, or in some cases a recession, which tend to be fairly short, and economies tend to move past them relatively quickly. You then get another 7 year on average expansion, which is characterized by much higher growth rates and much more kind of optimism about the future, because the end of the last cycle is further into the past, and that's where things tend to go way over the top, and they crescendo into a peak, and then you get a major kind of crash, both in the stock market, in the property market. You get much higher periods of unemployment, a much deeper recession, in many cases quite significant spending cuts, which has an impact on the economy. Banks need to be bailed out, and that process of bust and recovery tends to take on average about 4 years. You have a sort of a 7 year expansion, a mid-cycle slowdown, another 7 year expansion, lasting on average about 14 years in total, and then a period of bust and recovery which lasts about 4 years to complete the 18-year cycle. Your second question was about why is it not more generally known, and the short answer to that is that most economic analysis tends not to regard land as a distinct factor of production, and so a lot of economic models are based upon ignoring land, and if you ignore land, then you don't have the analytical tools to see a cycle like this. And indeed, some economists say that economic events aren't cyclical in nature. So without that particular lens, you're not going to see it, and therefore, if you're not seeing it, you're not going to make recommendations to investors about the cycle. I think that has very much influenced the mainstream way in which we think about investments. So I think that's the reason why a lot of people don't know about it. But many property investors who've been around for 2 or 3 decades will have seen one, if not two, if not three cycles unfold and play out. The trick is to recognise them for what they are, which is new additions of a very old story.
Yeah, and I guess, I was thinking after reading, I kind of reflected a little bit about some of the other drivers or agents, let's say. We've got the banks and we've got government as two, prime agents in the overall economy. And, I guess my own question to myself was, isn't it really all the banks' fault for creating money out of nothing? And I guess to a similar extent, governments have done, especially recently with quantitative easing and those sorts of money creation, money printing approaches. Is it really, their fault. I am challenging, I suppose, the principle behind what you're saying, where it starts. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is quite an important issue. Banks clearly have a role to play in increasing the amount of money that within an economy, and therefore they enable people to speculate. And when speculation gets out of control, you very much amplify the boom and therefore create a much bigger bust as a result. But the cycle kind of fundamentally attracts that kind of activity, and in my view is prior to the bank's activity. Just to answer the point about money creation, it's actually the legitimate role of the banks to create money. When they make a loan, they create a corresponding deposit in an account, which is then spent into the economy. That's exactly what banks are designed to do. And so when people borrow, money is created, and when they repay the loan, that money disappears again, and it kind of goes over and on throughout the economy. It's actually a very beautiful process, and it enables a huge amount of economic activity to take place that wouldn't take place otherwise. The problem is that when it goes to activities which don't generate increased production, then you tend to get an inflationary environment. And of course, if it's not about increased production, then it's just about increasing asset prices, which means there's no kind of additional economic activity to back that up. And so if that then folds over when you get a bust, then all that sort of money disappears from the economy, and businesses are starved of credit, and you get a general kind of malaise because they have to start laying people off, which reduces demand within the economy, which creates a recession and so on, all the various things that we've lived through over the last few years. When the Bank of England created quantitative easing, they were to a certain extent trying to replace the money that had been lost to the economy by banks stopping their lending activities. And the other thing they were trying to do was to ensure that asset prices wouldn't fall any further, because if they had failed to do that, then banks would have been in a much more serious position than they were in at the time. And so it's not adding any kind of particular additional money into the economy. It's actually replacing money that's been lost. And it's quite a complicated sort of argument that I've made, and I appreciate that some listeners might find it difficult to follow, but essentially banks are supposed to create money in an economy. That's their function.
Yep, I get you. Just one sort of follow-on question to the whole issue with banks. I kind of just more from the personal interest point of view, when I read your work, one of the stages, of course, is post-crash and then the recovery, is how the banks recover, ready for the next cycle. And I just wondered how that happened, because obviously they're going to carry a lot of debt on their books, but how do they actually recover? What things happen, or they just literally write it off and then recapitalise and go again? Is that the long and short of it?
No, they can't. They can't simply write it off like a normal business. What tends to happen is the government, through its interventions, stops asset prices falling, and they sort of do nothing for a while, and then they start to rise slowly. And once they start to rise, it's at that point the banks can start offloading the bad debts that they had created. And if you watch the news quite carefully, every so often you'll see a story about how Deutsche Bank or Barclays or HSBC have sold off another part of their loan portfolio, and they're generally selling it at par, which means that prices have moved back to levels that were seen at the end of the last cycle, and banks are not losing any money on those portfolios. In addition to that, they tend to focus their lending activities on very safe activity, so they tend to lend very much to governments and very high-end borrowers, and that enables them to recapitalize. And once that process is completed, then that's the conditions at which they start lending to the rest of the economy, and that's when proper growth returns to the economy. So what we've seen over the last very slow growth, well, that's partly because banks are not lending to normal businesses. They've been recapitalizing and trying to offload all of the assets that they created, i.e. by lending money to companies and to property investors and so on. In the last cycle, they've been offloading all of that activity and getting themselves set up for the next cycle.
Great. All right. Thank you. I have to ask you, I mean, there's the link between the property cycle and the stock market cycle, which is quite evident in your analysis that I looked at. But one that sort of sticks out a bit, perhaps you can give a little bit of comment on that, is the dot-com crash. It wasn't necessarily linked to a property crash directly anyway. What are your thoughts on that? Was that an exception, or?
Yes and no. Stock markets have their own cycles, and periodically you get periods of great speculation and people very interested in stocks. And in the case of the dot-com, they didn't really understand the internet and e-commerce and so on, and they got carried away with all the hype, and companies that didn't have any earnings to back up a high share price was still attracting a lot of buying of their shares. So everyone got carried away, and then it obviously came down to earth in a very major way in 2000 with a dot-com bust. Now, that wasn't, as you point out, related to property cycle per se, but the timing is quite interesting because it did coincide quite closely with the mid-cycle slowdown that I referred to earlier as one of the phases of the 18-year cycle. And you tend to find that around that time in the cycle, the stock market is quite weak. Probably in fairness, in the US, the dot-com bust slightly preceded the recession, but the recession almost resulted out of the loss of confidence, and then you had September the 11th, and you had various corporate scandals going on, and so people probably left the stock market around the same time that the property market was showing a bit of a slowdown. So the timing does tie in, but it's not directly correlated with the property cycle. The thing to really watch out for as a stock market investor is the final stages of the cycle, where things firstly go over the top, and that often results in a major boom in the stock market, which we got in between sort of 2003 and 2007, and then almost without fail, at the end of the property cycle, the stock market will correct by about 35 to 50%. So it loses 35 to 50% of its value at and after the peak of the property cycle. So it really is something very important to watch out for a whole range of investors.
Yep, I can understand that, trying to avoid those falling off the cliff events. Kind of moving into the property cycle and geography a little bit. What I wanted to sort of pick your brains on there was talking about the property cycle from a geographic point of view globally. In other words, do we have the same property cycles the world over? And that's part one of the question. And I'll probably come and talk to you about within a certain market. So let's say regional markets within the UK. But let's stick with the global property cycle for now. What do we have the same cycle the world over, and does it unfold at the same pace everywhere?
That's a really good question. The jury is still out to a certain extent, and the reason is that in other economies, particularly emerging markets, we really don't have the historical evidence to back up our assessment of how the property cycle works. For advanced countries, we all tend to be on the same cycle, and we tend to follow the same timing as the US. The US is maybe 6 months ahead of the UK, and the UK is maybe 6 months ahead of other countries such as Australia and parts of Europe. But broadly speaking, it's all the same kind of timing, and it's generally speaking very much the 18-year cycle historically. It's starting to appear to be the case that you are getting an 18-year cycle in emerging markets, but they're not timed to the same way. Now, the East Asian crisis in '97, it was a financial crisis, or it's known as a financial crisis, but actually it was preceded very much by a period of intense property speculation, which resulted in a major bust, which, as I've said, affects all the other parts of the economy, including the banking system, and created a full-blown financial crisis which affected all of those tiger economies in East Asia. And that was in '97. You're starting to see the same kind of weaknesses in those economies 18 years after that. And the last few years were periods of fairly high property price growth as well. So it does appear to be the case that they do have a property cycle, and it does time in at 18 years, but not on the same kind of wavelength as the cycles that affect Western economies. Having said that, we're only talking about 2 cycles. You'd want to have a longer historical record before you would be definitive about it, as I am with the UK and the US. But it does seem to be working that way.
Okay, great. And I think just looking like intra-market, if you like, for a moment, this podcast has got primarily a UK-based audience. So let's take the UK as an example. Do you see differences in regional markets across the UK? Is it the same cycle, and does it unfold at a different pace if it is the same cycle across the regions?
I'd say it's the same cycle, but the cycle is not uniform in the sense that in the first half of the cycle, you tend to see the first signs of activity in the center of a city or the center of a country. And then over time, it spreads out to the more peripheral locations, both at the edge of the city, or I guess if you're looking at a country from the main cities out into the smaller cities and to kind of more marginal locations. So while London has really kicked off this cycle in a very major way, you wouldn't expect, as far as I'm concerned, to see the same start in other parts of the UK. They would tend to follow London as, once London is kind of underway, then investors are looking to other parts of the city and then other parts of the country to make their investments, and you start then to see increased demand leads to increased prices, etc. So it's the same cycle, but it kind of plays out to a different sort of timetable within sort of the various phases of the cycle.
Yeah. Now, you and I have been speaking, haven't we, over a period of time now? And I think one of the topics we've been sort of mulling over or kicking around between us is this idea that perhaps there are I'm coming at it from the point of view there might be different strategies that might be more applicable at different phases in a property cycle. Do you want to give a bit of an insight into maybe what some of our readers and listeners might expect coming forward, maybe from a collaboration point of view?
Yeah, well, given that the cycle plays out in as far as I'm concerned, a fairly regular fashion, you can then start to see certain things happening at similar times within the cycle. For example, towards the end of the cycle, you invariably get a period of rising interest rates. At the beginning of the cycle, interest rates are held very low for quite some time. At the beginning of the cycle, it's very hard to get bank credit and bank financing. At the end of the cycle, it tends to be very easy, and so on. I think that those different sort of features make different property strategies more kind of more easy to execute at different times. And so I guess our discussions have tried to kind of uncover when the optimum time is to apply a particular property strategy based upon the sorts of things that happen at each phase of the cycle. It's very much groundbreaking research, so it would be very good to share ideas and provide some of that to your listeners.
Yeah, I'm actually really looking forward to that. And so, just to put a bit of context, I think what we're looking to do is collaborate and maybe put out a blog post or something of that description to sort of flesh those thoughts out. So, if the Property Voice, if you watch our blog or listen to the podcast, just look out for that, because Akil and I have been quite excited actually about putting these things together, the cycle and applied strategies over a period of time. So I really appreciate you agreeing to work with me on that, Akil. It's fabulous.
Yeah, no, looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. So I guess just to draw a little bit of a close, just maybe where can people find out about you, and do you in fact have any offers potentially or information you could share with listeners if they make contact with you?
Well, the best way to reach me is through my website, which is www.theascendantstrategy.com. On the website you'll find a few resources. I've written articles. I've got a few blog posts and links to interviews with other people. And I do encourage listeners to read those posts and listen to those interviews, because I do try and provide a lot of value for free to people, because I think this is a very important topic and I would like investors to know more about it. They can also download a free ebook which is titled 7 Reasons Why Investors Need to Understand the 18-Year Cycle, and then also a few research reports available for purchase if people really want to get into this topic and learn a bit more about what the cycle is, how it works, what sorts of things happen within each phase, and how to, in some ways, tell the time about where we are within the cycle.
Gotcha. And I guess I should just say, have I missed anything really? Is anything that's is on top of your mind that you think, I must say this before the end of this interview, or am I ready to close things up and just and call it a day? Is there anything there that I've missed, in other words, key questions?
Well, I suppose one question your listeners might have in their minds is, where are we currently in the cycle?
Yeah, that one.
Well, I mean, if we look at recent history, the peak of the last cycle in the UK was in 2007, according to my research, and I think that was certainly the peak of the property market, peak of the stock market, and so on. The UK, to my mind, spent the next 4 to 5 years really sort of working through the crash and the process of recovery after that, and was really in a position to start the new cycle in around 2012, 2011. We're now sort of 3 or 4 years into the first phase of the next cycle. So I would not expect this cycle to peak for at least another decade. So it really is a good time to be looking to invest and find good deals and make long-term investment decisions which will yield good returns over the next few years.
Yeah, thanks for pointing out that obvious question that I omitted. That was very useful, and I think it's encouraging to people to know that potentially we're on an upswing. But as we've been alluding to, there are strategies that could work at any point in the cycle, which is another cue really to stay tuned, because we're going to hopefully produce some information and additional insights in that regard. But Akil, I just want to say thanks so much. I really appreciate you coming on the Property Voice podcast and sharing your wisdom and your research with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. And look out for the paper that we're looking to collaborate on. That should be coming out in the near future. But Akil, once again, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Up next is Your Voice. It's all about you and your property world.
Now, just before I dive into Your Voice fully, I just wanted to, acknowledge the input we had there from Akhil Patel with regard to the 18-year property cycle. And as we mentioned towards the end of the interview, we're planning to collaborate together on a blog post and possibly more in terms of how to make the 18-year property cycle relevant to our property investing strategy over time. So watch this space over the coming weeks on that one. And we'll return to the theme of property cycles more generally next time on the show for a fuller elaboration. But back to Your Voice then. Today we're going to keep Your Voice, short and sweet, and simply share a 5-star review we had in from Northern Monkey. who says, greatest podcast ever. Perhaps a slight exaggeration there, but we appreciate the sentiment all the same. He says, goes on to say, great format and something new for the property podcast market. Keep up the good work and sort out the episode title for episode 2. I think we managed to sort that out, actually. I know we had a couple of issues way back, but I think that's all been done now. So thank you very much, Northern Monkey. Really appreciate that. And of course, the Your Voice segment is all about you and your opinion. And whether it's a review, just like that one, a question, a property story, or just a good old moan, really, we're here for you. We're here for you. So drop me a note with what's on your mind, and we'll try and feature as many contributions in the show as we possibly can. You can email us, podcast@thepropertyvoice.net. You can post on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/thepropertyvoice. Tweet at Property Voice UK. Or you can indeed leave us a voicemail on our website. The choice, as they say, is yours. But hear this, we really love the iTunes reviews and the voicemails the best. Just saying. Next up, the shout out.
And now, where you can go for more great resources with the shout out.
Now, as I shared with you last week, I'm running a 10K on the 7th of November, and I'm doing this to raise money for a school in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. Now, one resource that I found helpful is an app called Runkeeper, and as the name suggests, it helps to train in running with distance and pace settings, and it records your progress against goals and that type of thing. However, it's not restricted to purely the activity of running. It also works with road and mountain biking, for example. Also walking and hiking, skiing and snowboarding, and even, would you believe, swimming. Although I've not actually put it to the test with swimming, but I suspect I might need more waterproof protection on my phone if I'm going to use it in the swimming pool. So yeah, I'm interested to see how that one works. But there we go. But the bottom line is it's pretty nifty, really. So if you're struggling for motivation in your exercise activities, then give Runkeeper a go, and the link will be in the show notes as all the links are. And quickly on the subject of running, why not check out what I'm up to on the 7th of November, and more to the point, the backstory behind this school in the Amazon I'm supporting, by checking out a blog post I've written, along with some photos to paint a better picture of the story. The blog post is called Giving in Action, Supporting an Amazonian School. You'll find it over at thepropertyvoice.net. And the teacher and the kids there are literally, truly inspirational. And so it's well worth a shout out for sure. Okay, so that's all we have time for today then. 3 things that I would encourage you to do this week are: 1, leave us a review in iTunes. We will read out all the 5-star reviews on the show. 2, check out the blog post I just mentioned about the Amazon School and their inspiring teacher over at thepropertyvoice.net. And 3, don't forget to have a great week in property, will you? Meanwhile, you can always email me personally. I keep saying the podcast. You can email me personally, podcast@thepropertyvoice.net, and the show notes will be over at the website, thepropertyvoice.net. But right now, at least, all that remains for me to say, once again, is thank you very much for listening this week. And until next time on the Property Voice podcast, it's ciao ciao.
Thank you for listening today. Now head over to thepropertyvoice.net for more inspirational content and get updates through our mailing list. Join us next time on the Property Voice podcast. And if you enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate us on iTunes.